afternoon. This hearing will come to order. We're joined here by the 53rd Secretary of the Department of Interior, Mr. David Bernhardt. And this is Mr. Bernhardt's first time testifying before this subcommittee as Secretary. So I want to congratulate you on your confirmation and welcome. We had intended to begin our hearing session with you, but unfortunately the confirmation process in the Senate got in the way and forced us to postpone. So today is our 15th and final budget hearing. So rather than leading off with you, you're the closer. Since March, we've heard from witnesses in the department's budget office, the permanent and acting heads of the Bureau, from the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, and those who've been instructed and allowed. Excuse me, we've got a lot of feedback going on. I think they fixed it. I didn't know I had that much power. I guess it came back on. So we'll see how we go, but I apologize for the feedback that members are hearing up here. As I was saying, we've heard from the acting heads of the bureaus, from the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. Those hearings have been instructive, and they've allowed us to delve deeply into the details of the budget. Today, Secretary Bernhardt will explain to us how the administration's proposed budget cuts, when taken in sum, impact and shape the Department of Interior and how they fit into his vision. Mr. Secretary, I'm also interested to learn how you intend to proceed with these controversial policies and proposals initiated by the previous Secretary. These include the administration's proposal to advance oil and gas leasing on nearly the entire U.S. outer continental shelf, the rush to open up drilling in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, and in my opinion, the reckless push to mine and drill in our public lands, including in my home state of Minnesota, where sulfide ore mining poses a critical risk to the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness Area and Voyageurs National Park. It's also not surprising that President Trump would appoint officials whose ties to the oil and gas industry run deep, and that's because of his focus on, as he calls it, energy dominance. But I'm concerned about the administration's prioritization of profits for the fossil fuel industry over the protection of our national treasures and the conservation of our natural habitats. That's our shared responsibility to the American people, not only for today, but for tomorrow. We have an obligation to ensure that no conflicts of interest exist, and that's why I requested that the Inspector General conduct an impartial and rigorous investigation, and I am pleased that the IG has accepted my request. Former Secretary Zinke also had a bold vision for massive department-wide reorganization, and I, along with many others, had clearly and repeatedly expressed concerns to him. But unfortunately, many of them remain unaddressed, and I know that you would like to talk about that and how you're going to proceed in the future. So I hope that you will articulate to the community, to the committee, how the department will be reshaping these essential functions. Turning to the budget, as acting secretary, you led to its formulation, and you were responsible for the declining priorities and the cuts that it proposes. For fiscal year 2020, the Department of Interior is seeking $11.4 billion for the Bureau's programming funded through the Interior Appropriations Bill. That is a $1.6 billion cut, or a 12% decrease from fiscal year 2019 enacted levels. I've spoken at length about the details of these cuts in the other hearings, and the bottom line is this is an unrealistic funding levels in the Trump budget. It causes needless worry by the American people who care deeply about our public lands, federal employees, and the volunteers who work for them to protect them. If enacted in its current form, which this bill will not be, the budget would have had significant impacts on our nation's public lands. So I look forward to working with Ranking Member Joyce and my colleagues on this committee to ensure that the Department of Interior has the necessary funding. Mr. Secretary, you and I, as we've discussed, we do have policy differences, but I know that we will have a respectful and professional relationship, and I look forward to working with you in areas where we do find common ground. Before I turn to Ranking Member Joyce, though, I'd like to highlight something that a lot of us became aware of over the weekend. The United Nations report on biodiversity was released yesterday, and it's quite alarming. And the report states, and I quote from it, "Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and a rate of species extinction is accelerating. Mr. Bernhardt, you are the steward of our national and cultural resources. The country is depending upon you to help lead the fight along with us to combat these issues. And yes, that does mean factoring in climate change into management decisions. So at this time, I would like to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Joyce, for any opening remarks he would like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And that was not my barking dog.
That's my dog. He's going to be here this week.
And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished witness, Secretary Bernhardt. Congratulations on your recent confirmation as the 53rd Interior Secretary, and thank you to your dedicated work to this department over the years. I support the administration's push to cut red tape and regulatory costs to improve federal services. Just in the past 2 years under your leadership, the department has delivered and initiated the regulatory actions estimated to reduce the regulatory burden on the American economy by $3.7 billion. In addition, in 2018, the department set records for both traditional and renewable energy leases and increased funds dispersed to the states, tribes, and conservation programs. The department also expanded public access on millions of acres of land, protected new areas of natural and cultural significance, and prioritized permitting and repairing infrastructure on public lands. I look forward to today's discussion on how the department plans to build on these successes, particularly in this challenging budget environment. Current law mandates the President submit a fiscal year 2020 budget proposal to Congress that would cut non-defense discretionary spending by 9%. We have before us today a discretionary budget proposal for the Department of Interior that has been drafted in accordance with this budget cap. Interior's contribution is a $1.6 billion or 12% cut from the fiscal year 2019 enacted level. We don't yet know if Congress and the President will agree on changes to the budget caps for fiscal year 2020. If we can't, and if we can't prioritize, then a 9% across-the-board cut will happen. So for the time being, this budget proposal is a necessary and useful exercise in prioritization, even though I disagree with some of the choices proposed. As appropriators, we have some holes to fill. Notably, Asian carp and prevention is cut by $5.1 million, and harmful algal bloom research is cut by $2.3 million in the budget request. Asian carp are a serious concern across the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes basins. Those who live in the area are already infested with these invasive fish, want to see them gone. Those of us living nearby are doing everything we can to avoid an infestation. We need to be setting our sights on eradication instead of settling for simply controlling them in perpetuity. Harmful algal blooms are a huge problem for Lake Erie and the district I represent in Northeast Ohio. Blooms have been recorded in every state and have become a nationwide concern. The U.S. Geological Survey has been a key partner in development and testing of promising, cost-effective treatment technique along Lake Erie. I'm concerned that the proposed cut to the harmful algal bloom research at USGS will impact that work. These programs are important not only to my constituents, but the constituents of many of my colleagues. I look forward to working with them in the days and weeks ahead to ensure that these programs will continue. Another trouble spot is the maintenance of the National Park System. The Park Service deferred maintenance backlog has grown to nearly $12 billion. That alarming number has prompted several important initiatives that we can all be proud of, like the Centennial Challenge and the proposed Public Lands Infrastructure Fund, which will help to significantly reduce the backlog on our public lands. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the Park Service cyclical maintenance budget isn't keeping up with the need and is so adding to the backlog each year. This fiscal year 2020 budget proposal is moving cyclical maintenance in the wrong direction by cutting it by nearly $18 million. Despite these and other trouble spots in this budget proposal, there are bright spots and merit highlighting for which the Secretary and the Department deserve credit. The first is forest management. Fiscal year 2020 marks the first year of implementation of the Fire Fix, which will provide an additional $2.3 billion of suppression funding outside of this subcommittee's allocation if needed, so long as an amount equivalent to the fiscal year 2015 suppression costs are appropriated in this bill, which the administration's budget proposes to do. Not only does this budget help end the practice of fire borrowing, it proposes to more actively manage forests in order to prevent devastating wildfires from happening in the first place. I recognize that upholding the tribal trust obligation is a responsibility shared by all members of Congress, regardless of congressional district. I also recognize the federal government still has a long way to go before it can say that it is fully meeting its trust and treaty obligations. To help us better fulfill this promise, this budget promises to consolidate the Department's Indian education responsibilities into a truly autonomous Bureau of Indian Education. It's clear that this proposal is in direct response to directions given by this subcommittee and recommendations of the Government Accountability Office. Finally, budgets for the Bureau of Land Management and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management are proposing increases for both renewable and non-renewable energy sources. I agree with this all of the above approach because we can't protect American jobs if we can't power them. And increasing our domestic energy capacity is the right thing to do because it fuels our industries, improves the national security, and is better for our planet. With that, I thank you again for being here today, Secretary Bernhardt. I look forward to your testimony and our discussion, and I thank my chair for yielding me this time, and I yield back.
Well, thank you. Once again, Mr. Joyce and I and the committee members welcome you. Please we generally do 5 minutes, but if you need a little more than that, feel free to take it, and we will put your full remarks into the record. And with that, Secretary Bernhardt, welcome again.
Good afternoon, Chair McCollum and Ranking Member Joyce and other members of the committee. Can you hear me okay? I'm a little deaf and I'm never quite sure. You can? All right, good. That's great. I really do appreciate the invitation to testify before you today. You'll insert my written statement into the record. Let me begin by sharing a perspective with you, since this is my first hearing before you. And that is that I've worked for 3 secretaries, and I know several more. And they all have told me at different points in my career how important it is to have a good working relationship with this particular committee. So I do look forward to working with each of you and being candid on those areas where we don't agree, and listening to views and trying to find those areas where we actually do agree. So I think I'm excited about that, and I will do my best to make that happen. I know that you have already heard so much about the department. I spent some time going over everybody else's testimony, and I've actually attached that testimony to mine, so to refresh your recollection. And what I thought would be helpful to do is lay out kind of the bigger questions I think that might be on your minds, and then we can go from there. First, Chair McCollum, you've been very clear in your view that the President proposes and Congress disposes. As someone whose career began as a low-level staffer in the House of Representatives, I've always shared that view and appreciate it. And when we look at the bigger issues in the budget, from my perspective, it's probably useful to start with my views on reorganization. From my perspective, the President directed that we think about a reorganization, and Secretary Zinke put a tremendous amount of time and effort into a view. And his view of reorganization was probably best captured with 4 distinct activities. The first was to develop a unified regional boundary area for all of the bureaus except for the Bureau of Indian Education and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the regions that he initially conceived of were really rooted in science and focused primarily on ecosystems and watersheds. After he had received a lot of feedback, he kept that general area, but modified them to a certain extent to accommodate political boundaries. And we also kept the BLM state directors in place. That seemed to be a very important component for certain folks. So in August of 2018, this committee and its counterpart in the Senate allowed the department to move forward in defining those boundaries. And we are now moving to institutionalize those boundaries. And what that means is new departmental manual chapters, new alignment, not necessarily the move of people, but certainly the realignment in the boundaries. And I think that part of the reorganization is very useful because I do think it means that our senior managers are all focused on the same geographical area. I think it means that we have opportunities to think about the department having one voice on multi-jurisdictional and complex issues. I think that's good. As somebody who served as deputy secretary, the role of deputy is also to reconcile disagreements between two bureaus within the department, and it seems like that could be something that could be done lower down. So that the bureaus have been modified, the boundaries have been modified, and that's institutionalized. The second part of his thinking was to contemplate moving headquarters elements of particular bureaus west. BLM has a lot of traction in that area. He also contemplated USGS. And from my perspective, when I became deputy secretary, a Senate staffer gave me a copy of the debate that created the office of undersecretary, which was essentially the deputy secretary. And at that time, in 1936, when the secretary testified and asked for a deputy, the back and forth was about how hard the secretary worked, which was undoubtedly true, but the members of the Senate were demanding that the secretary or this new deputy spend more than half their time out in the West. So I think this is an issue that we've thought about for a long time, and so I think there's room to think and continue to think and interest in moving certain headquarters elements west, and we want to do that. The third element he had was what he called a unified regional commander, and that was largely a commander in each of these regions, a regional director in each of these regions that would kind of be a super regional director focused on cross-jurisdictional issues, would also have a bureaucracy of its own. And I have serious questions about the utility of that, and I'm happy to talk to you about that. And that's part of his budget that I probably would say we can spend some time thinking about. Obviously, you'll spend time thinking about it all, and I'm not trying to take your space away in any shape or form. Every secretary has struggled to find the optimal solution for how you manage the regions as secretary. And different models have been used. Alaska has a political person that is in the secretary's office that's actually located in Alaska. Ken Salazar had different approaches. Our departmental manual allows for field special assistants. That's been around since the Reagan administration. So each secretary has tried to come up with the optimal approach to that. My view is that we can certainly use the field assistant in the near term. We can also think about a first among equals. So I have some ideas about how we might better manage that. The fourth component of reorganization is very important from my perspective, and that is the component of looking for opportunities for shared services in procurement, in IT, in human resources. I think it's a legitimate question to ask an organization like the Department of Interior whether they need 10 different HR groups versus maybe one that's really performing very well. We procure an enormous amount of stuff, and maybe if we did that on a joint basis, we would be better off. So I am very interested in studying those issues and trying to deploy shared services, because that's where I think we can find some efficiencies that would allow us to reposition resources in the field where they're actually very badly needed. And so that, I think, is something worth exploring. Other issues that are important to me that may not be on your radar screen. I fundamentally believe that we need to permanently transform the department's ethics program. We need to elevate it. Since I joined the administration, we've added 42 career professional ethics advisors. We have a new DEA, a designated agency ethics official. We have an alternative designated agency ethics official. And here's my view. It's very important, whether it's the next secretary or the one after that or the one after that, that we create an ethics environment that is very stable within the department. Today, or actually yesterday, I received a draft IG report that you all will see soon, that where a Park Service employee worked with a friends group to have a painting procured for $39,000. And in doing that, went through the Friends Group instead of the procurement office because the painter had a tax lien. And they were trying to avoid any of the costs of a tax lien, like the consequence of a tax lien ending up on the painter. You know, that stuff is not good. It's not acceptable. And part of it is training. We have good people that make mistakes. Part of it is overall sensitivity to the issues. We've spent a lot of time, and I don't mean you personally, but there's been a lot of focus on fundraising and these other things, and those are good things. But they have to be done within very well-defined rules. And we need to help people to ensure they're successful in that. When I'm on the road and I give a meeting for regional directors, I ask them, in the regional offices, I say, can you tell me who your ethics official is? Just raise your hand. Very few can. That's not good in the space that we're in. So I would like to see some more help in that. As you mentioned, the deteriorating infrastructure, everybody can see it. I was in Acadia. They have a maintenance shed that is concrete, well, sorry, it's cinder block with grout, obviously. You can see through the grout and outside. Like, that's incredible. And it's their only large maintenance shed. We need to make those investments. You all have made a conscious effort to make an investment, but we need to help move that forward. I've spent a great deal of time on harassment. We have a strong harassment policy. We've taken very significant action. There's much more to do in that area, and that's something that we need to spend a lot of time on. And wild horses and burros. I know in the West, this is a big issue. Everywhere else, it's not. I grew up in the West. My grandparents have a wonderful ranch in Wyoming that was very close to Mary O'Hara's, the site where she wrote the book, My Friend Flicka. I love wild horses. When I sat down with the Fish and Wildlife Service for the first time and asked them to go over major threats to sage grouse, wild horses was on their list as like a significant threat. The ecological damage that's occurring is significant. And we have to find a way to deal with this issue in a way that works for everybody. But frankly, the numbers that we're carrying today are twice what they were when I was at the Department of the Interior in the early 2000s, and we thought we had a gigantic problem then. We have to find a way to solve it. It's not good for the environment, it's certainly not good for the horses. I know that many of you care deeply about the Great Lakes, and so I've been very nervous about this hearing until I saw the President's statement on March 28th. So I'm all in. And I will tell you that I was amazed at how many times carp came up in my confirmation process. A senator told me that there's a proposal to create concrete from carp. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, and USGS is working on a whole host of things, but carpcrete may be the answer of the future. Let me close, because I've taken a long time, to let you know that I will work very hard to further the President's vision and to strike a balance, the right balance between the protection and the sustainable use of our resources in a way that will provide conservation stewardship, enhance the safety of our communities, increase energy security, and allow America to prosper. At the same time, I will try to meet the Secretary's or the administration's objectives within the confines of the budget we have. And that concludes my statement.
Well, thank you. And as you know, there are many of us who live in the Great Lakes region who serve on this committee. But Mr. Joyce and I recognize the importance because of the importance we place on our regional geographic watershed quality improvements that we recognize the others around the United States, right, Mr. Joyce? We strive to be fair. My first question, I'm going to expand a little bit on my opening remarks. The UN report also stated, and I quote from that, "The health of the ecosystems on which we all and other species depend upon is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide. Around 1 million animals and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades, more than ever before in human history. So, Mr. Secretary, like the fourth National Climate Assessment, this information is very sobering, and I believe it's a call for action. So with the release of this information, will the Department of Interior take a pause in its approach to energy development to re-examine the impacts of these operations on ecosystems, species, and habitats to see if there are better approaches? The report, and I'll just kind of bundle two other things together for you so you can respond in total. The report also states that the abundance of native species in most major land-based habitats has declined by 20%. And so I want to know how the department's going to work to sustain native plants on public lands, and I think you touched on it a little bit about the challenges we have with wild burros and horses. But the last thing that I'll mention that the report highlights is the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on nature, with those impacts projected to increase over the coming decades. So I believe, and I believe many Americans would agree with me, that we can't continue business as usual approach. So how's the department going to incorporate this science into your everyday operations and long-range planning? In other words, what are you doing to make sure that the United States is a leader and not a contributor in the eroding the foundations of our economies, our livelihood, and the health and quality of life, not only here in America, but worldwide?
So I appreciate that question. I'll give you my perspective on this. And before doing so, I'll give you a couple facts about me. I recognize that climate is changing. I recognize that man is a contributing factor. And I've spent a good amount of time with our scientists trying to figure out how the best practices we can utilize to factor their understanding of science as it stands into making informed legal and policy decisions. And I've spent a good amount of time with the fourth assessment, and if you look at that report, you don't have to read far, you can just read into the overview, and you will see that even they recognize that the largest uncertainty in projecting future climate conditions is the level of GHG going forward. And that really is because those future levels depend on a variety of factors: economic, political, technological, and demographic. And those are difficult to predict. So what our scientists tell us is that the best practice is to recognize that there is no one right model or right forcing scenario, that all are plausible future states. And the best thing we can do in making an informed decision is to look at multiple models, multiple scenarios with representative concentration pathways. The standard, 4, 2.6, 4.5, 6, 8.5, they say don't just pick one. There is, it is very important for what we do legally and for ensuring that things are upheld in the courts, that we recognize what the science is and articulate a rational basis for it. If we can't articulate a rational basis, our decisions won't be sustained. Now, that's the first part of your question. The second part is, are we going to stop oil and gas development because of this report? And the answer to that is no. Congress, you all, have the ability to decide whether we do anything on federal lands, and you've decided, the lands that we manage, you've decided a whole host of different range of things. On some things, you've decided that it's wilderness and should be enjoyed for the solitude and enjoyment of the people and untrammeled by man. On other things, you've decided that this is a national park and it should be managed that way. And on other areas, you've decided that the land is for multiple use. We go through a planning process. That planning process can result in some areas that are for solitude, other areas are for multiple use. But at the end of the day, we also have the Mineral Leasing Act. And if you have a view on what you want to happen, we'll carry it out when you execute it. And that is my position.
Well, thank you. The UN report is a lot more than just on climate change. It's also about pollution, mining, and land use. And so I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair, and I think my committee members know that I usually don't even go first, so I'm gonna follow this up, because I think this kind of leads into my second question. And it's about something that you and I have just discussed before, and the committee knows probably where I'm going with this. As I'm deeply concerned about the decisions the Department of Interior made, and along with the Department of Agriculture, regarding mineral leasing on the Superior National Forest. It's within the watershed of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, the most heavily visited wilderness area in the system, in Voyageurs National Park. And people can, get into, well, it's not in the park, or it's not in the Boundary Waters Wilderness Canoe Area, but it's in the middle of a body of water that both this area flows through, and also flows north to our Canadian neighbor. And as you know, it's an area known for pristine waters and diverse wildlife, including several endangered species, which leads me back to the first part of the question that I asked you about the UN assessment about what are we going to do about sustaining native plants, and I would say animals on public lands. The department's currently being sued for unlawful reinstating the Twin Metals mining leases in the watershed. They were denied under the last administration. In December, the Trump administration canceled a proposed mineral withdrawal in the area, and it abandoned a related environmental assessment. Secretary Perdue announced the cancellation, and the Department of Interior has also been active in participating in this withdrawal. So I asked you in March 1st in a letter to provide us with all the documents and communications regarding the decision to reinstate the expired Twin Metal leases, the decision to cancel the mineral withdrawal and environmental assessment, the decision to propose renewal of the Twin Metals leases, and any other pending or potential mineral actions on the Superior National Forest. So I want to know when you think the committee can expect to receive this documentation, because I really think it does go to the heart of protecting water, protecting native plants, and protecting some species in the area which are threatened and possibly endangered. We have been waiting, for example, also for Freedom of Information Act's requests have turned up in meetings and emails showing communications within the department, including with you personally about this issue. We have an email dated October 3rd, 2017 from a personnel in the solicitor's office to you asking about briefing on Twin Metals withdrawal application. The list of attachments includes briefing papers on the withdrawal and something entitled the Draft Release Renewal Scenarios with Comment. So I'm wondering when we can expect, based on my March 1st request, this information to come to this committee, so that we can take a look and find out how the discussion to overturn the Twin Metals leases came to be, and who was all involved in deciding to be part of a withdrawal.
So I fully appreciate and respect the request. It's sometimes challenging when we're in the middle of deliberation on what documents can come up and what can't, and that's no disrespect to the committee in any way, shape, or form. We met 2 days ago, I think. I went back and suggested that we need to take a hard look at what we could give you, so we can give you what we can now. My view is that the Assistant Secretary will make a decision. There's two different tiers of leases here that are involved. both of them, if the applicant were to go forward, or the right holder, however you want to say it, there's lots of opportunity for comment review. There's no way that we're going to approve something that is destructive to the boundary waters. But there are processes we go through to analyze that. We can't approve a mine plan of operation that would cause jeopardy or adversely modify or destroy critical habitat. And all of those things will be looked at the appropriate time. So, I can commit to trying to get you the documents we can before decisions are made, and getting you the appropriate documents after decisions are made, and ultimately, working through the issue with you. This may be one that we see differently, but that doesn't mean for a moment that your folks don't have opportunities for comment, that there's not opportunities for judicial review. I appreciate all of that.
Well, thank you. I'll be following up, but this committee is finding whether it is getting lists from the Department on School Construction and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and other places, EPA, and that. Sometimes it takes a long time to get a letter answered, and sometimes it's not answered very satisfactorily or with information that we need to have in front of us in order to make our budget decisions. But, sir, we will continue the discussion later. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Although funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative resides within the EPA budget, EPA is required to use these funds to coordinate with several other federal agencies like the Department of Interior to carry out Great Lakes restoration work. As of October 2018, the EPA has sent $607 million to Interior bureaus to implement the GLRI. I'm glad to hear that you agree with me and other members of the subcommittee that Great Lakes restoration is an important priority of the department. In light of your opening statement and the President's public comments in support of the initiative, and assuming Congress restores full funding, would you please take a minute to explain why the department would continue to receive funding for this initiative should continue to receive funding for this for this initiative in the fiscal year 2020?
So I think from my perspective, the reality is that several of our bureaus are actually involved here. Obviously, the Fish Wildlife Service, it's been mentioned. The U.S. Geological Survey, I think the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and even the Park Service are all involved to some extent. And their efforts go to support projects like habitat restoration, invasive species detection and mitigation, working to address algal blooms, and even tribal resource restoration with the Fond du Lac tribe. So I think it's a whole host of items. Obviously, I know that in your hearing with Director Riley, he talked about some magical ways that you could detect the presence of carp and other things. And so, look, I think if you give us the money, we will spend it.
Well, the USGS budget proposed a reduction of roughly $2.3 million and 9 full-time equivalent personnel from harmful algal bloom research. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the USGS has been a key partner in the development and testing of a promising, environmentally friendly, and cost-effective treatment technique along Lake Erie. I'm concerned that the proposed cut to harmful algal bloom research will impact this important work. Please tell us how and where the USGS proposes to scale back its harmful algal bloom research, since this affects almost all 50 states at this point.
Well, I think Director Riley'd say, he worked at NASA. He dealt with very significant cuts there, and they still were able to get the International Space Station up. I think he feels very strongly that he can accomplish his mission with the budget as provided, and we'll do that if that's what we end up with.
Well, in the 2020 budget proposes a combined $13.5 million in the Fish and Wildlife Services and USGS budget to control invasive Asian carp and prevent them from entering the Great Lakes. The subcommittee's investments in the recent years in Asian carp control and prevention now easily numbers in the tens of millions of dollars. Would you take a few minutes to update the Committee on the Interior's accomplishments to date with these recent investments in Asian carp control and prevention and your objectives for fiscal year 2020?
So I think that USGS and Fish are very proud of the development that they're seeing in the development and use of early detection tools using Asian carp DNA. They're containing Asian carp with injected carbon dioxide at pinch points. They're identifying potential spawning locations. They're enhancing and targeting commercial removal.
Could you take a moment to update us on the contract fishery for Asian carp that the Fish and Wildlife Service was beginning?
So it's my understanding that they're targeting removal efforts that really are at the leading edge of the invasion. They're working with state agencies to engage with commercial fishermen, and our goal continues to be eradication.
You know, it was just a few years ago under a former EPA Director McCarthy that I got her to admit that she had no problem with us fishing them to extinction, which is something we would wholeheartedly applaud.
Well, I think the word eradication is pretty definitive.
Is it a potential to eradicate it? Do you feel that there's a
Oh,
potential?
well, that's over my pay grade. I honestly don't, I don't want to get in, but I know if carp concrete can exist, there must be a strong demand.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Pingree?
And they're not yet in the Great Lakes, by the way. That's the real goal, right? Keep them out.
That's right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I got a chance to say hello to you earlier, and thank you for your recent visit to Maine. We appreciated it, and your story about the maintenance building is very true. It's a huge embarrassment, and also just a real challenge for the many hardworking people who have to try to get the job done in that building. And also, I know you talked with us in the state about the Katahdin Woods and Waters. We're very proud of that and really happy to have your support. And as an add-on, our lobster fishermen are desperately in need of bait in their fisheries, and we're just really hoping that there will be a transfer here of those nasty carp to our ocean for bait. They'll be cut up and frozen, so there won't be any chance of them surviving it, but.
Mr. Joyce and I will personally ship them to you.
Yeah, well, and we'll do the fair exchange. You'll get the lobsters back. It's a good deal, yeah. I just want to follow up a little bit on climate change. I think you get a lot of questions on climate change, and I think it's because you're a critically important leader in a time when, certainly in Congress, many of us are very concerned about this, but the American public is hearing these reports. The chair brought it up about, dwindling species. We talked a little bit about the National Climate Assessment in 2018, which was approved when you were deputy secretary there, so you were able to review that, and it goes into a lot of detail about detrimental things happening to areas in the DOI's mission, the Department of Interior's mission assets, the extreme weather, the impact on the national parks, the challenges that the tribes are having in many communities, having to move in places. It's serious everywhere. And so I guess I want to get you to say something about being more concerned. I've read some of the things you've said before, and believe that you have good intent, but I don't think we can say anymore when 99% of the scientists with multiple lines of evidence are saying, climate change is a problem. And yes, you said earlier, it's about the demographics and the economics. Well, the population is growing, and our president would say the economy's good. So, this is only pushing it further. And when you mentioned a political factor, you're a political leader right now that we are counting on. I come from Maine, and the ocean is warming there at a rate 99% faster than the rest of the world. Ocean warming has a huge impact on the weather that we're having. And more importantly for us, it's causing huge change in our fishing industry. Ocean acidification is likely to have a huge impact on our shellfish industry and our way of life. So I see this as an important role for the department. So I guess I'm going to ask you two questions about it and just try to push you a little more about it. Because in the National Climate Assessment, it talks about how the department anticipates and mitigates and protects these regions. And I'm in an area that really is feeling this. How do you see your role in helping us to adapt? And what in our budget is doing that with these budget cuts? And I guess the other thing that I'm concerned about is that there seem to be a lot of science vacancies at the Department of Interior, there's no real way to fill it in with this current budget, although I know we'll add more, but can you give me a number about how many science vacancies there are? Because if in fact you still think there are some questions about this, then I'm hoping you have all the scientists you can possibly have around you and that our departments are full of them, helping us to make these good assessments as these rapid changes are happening. So it's kind of two things. Isn't this really your job? Isn't this your job?
So, in terms of adaptation, I think we're doing a number of things that we're looking at in terms of some USGS studies. But the real question is, isn't it my job? And my perspective on this is probably a little different than yours. If I were to ask for a Lexis or Westlaw search, and for somebody to give me the number of times that the secretary is directed to do something, you'd find that there are over 600 instances in law that says, I shall do something. You know what there's not is a shall for I shall manage the land to stop climate change, or something similar to that. There's a shall that tells me to provide people to work on reports. There's some authorization, but there's no shalls. I mean, you guys come up with the shalls.
Yeah, but let me just
And with
interrupt.
all-
If the climate change assessment said these things are within the Department of Interior's mission assets, and there are Alaskan natives who are falling through unreliable ice and dying in their villages, and their villages are shrinking at an unsettling rate, that is part of your mission.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying you have to fix the big picture, but you have to
Yeah.
acknowledge that there is massive change going on.
I think I just did. I recognize that climate is changing, and I recognize that we, as a result of that, need to be thoughtful in our decision-making and account for that, and do it in a way that is robust and legally defensible. And so I'm not saying that nothing is happening. That's an entirely different question. And we, we do factor into if we see wildlife impacts, that needs to factor into our decision as to whether or not we list or delist or downlist. We are, in the vast majority of our decisions where it's relevant, we're already taking into account of it.
You keep
and that is
talking about being
reality.
legally defensible. I'm not sure, if scientists are lining up behind this as a big concern, where are the legal, I'm out of time really, so I can't keep pushing you on this, but maybe we can follow up with another conversation. I'd be
would
really
appreciate
interested
that.
to know where you think the legal challenges are that you can't move ahead. Because if there's something legally stopping you, then we're Congress, we make the laws, let us know. We'll work on that for you. I need to turn back my time, but I appreciate that, and I will follow up with about the science vacancies, because I do think it's really important you have
I'll
critical
find that
information, and
number out.
I'd like to know what the number is. I yield back. Thank you,
We'd
Madam.
like the vacancies for the record. Mr. Stewart?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bernhardt, thanks for your service. You have a tough job, and we're grateful that you're willing to try and do it. Now, I consider myself fairly even-keeled kind of guy, but you're going to hear some emotion because I'm very frustrated. I want you to know that I'm going to present my view on some things, and in doing so, I'm not going to only ask you to respond. Truly, I'm talking to my own committee and members and their staff as well, because some of my own brothers and sisters up here I've got to convince about this problem. A little more work to do. I'm going to read you a list of people and ask yourself what these organizations have in common. Listen to this. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the Society for Rangeland Management, the Humane Society Legislative Fund, the National Cattlemen's Association, the Humane Society of the United States, the American Mustang Federation. I could keep reading. I won't ask you what's in common. I think you know. These are a very diverse collection of organizations and people and groups who have come together after 5 years of working on this. We've got this incredibly diverse group of people to come together and to agree on a plan that will eliminate the problem of Western horses, of wild horses in the Western Range. And look, I didn't ask to be the horse guy. It just was thrown in my lap. And if you ask me why, it's because it's a problem in the West, and it's because I care about these animals, and someone's got to do something. And so we've come to a solution. It's supposed to be 27,000 animals, 88,000 as you know, and they're doubling about every 4 or 5 years. It's destroying the range. It is killing these animals, starving them to death. A meaningful change has got to take place here. And once again, we have an agreement. And it will eliminate this problem over a 10-year period. And I'm going to ask you to respond to that, but 3 final points to reemphasize. The status quo is not acceptable. We can't have 160,000 animals out in the western range. It will destroy the range. These animals will suffer and die by the tens of thousands. The second thing, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We have an agreement. And the third thing is a pilot program and $6 million is laughable to think that a pilot program isn't going to help us. We have to do more than that. And I just wondered if you would tell us of your support for this and whether you think that it's time for a change.
So I will tell you this, that I was unaware of this initiative until I was in the, I think, the Longworth cafeteria earlier this week, or early last week, or late last week. And some folks came over and sat down with me, and they're from, I think, the ASPCA. And they started talking about this, and I went back to the office and I said, is this even, like, is the group of collaborators, I mean, is this even actually true? And they looked into it. Here's the reality. The status quo is not working, and nothing we've tried before has worked. And our current program, well, it's a good effort, okay, but it's also not going to work. And my biggest concern about this program is whether it goes far enough, whether it maybe needs to be more than they proposed. But if you love the land and if you love the wild horses, you have to come to the conclusion that the status quo is terrible. No way around it.
So, and I should bridle myself, no pun intended, in the sense that I am frustrated by this, and I don't mean to diminish the efforts of the committee or others who've been working on this for a long time with me, because this has been not just my efforts. It's been other members of this committee, some of my Democratic friends, and some of the staff. But we just have to do better than we've done, and I don't know what else to do to try to move this forward. Last 30 seconds, 2 things for you. If you're going to move BLM headquarters, Utah is a great place, and we'd certainly welcome you. And we could argue the benefits of that, but Mr. Simpson would agree with me, I'm sure.
I think he's talking about Boise, Utah.
Yeah.
And the last thing is there's a thing we'd like to work with you on, and that's hydration equipment for our firefighters. They're out there improvising right now. They're carrying around bottles of water and improvising their own straws to suck out of, their own water containers. We think there's a better answer to that. It's important for us to give them, equipment that when they're in the heat of a fire, that we would help take care of them and their health. And you're probably
I'm happy to work with you on that one.
okay. Thank you, thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. At this time, I would like to ask my colleague, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for any questions she might have to the Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I come from New Jersey. We depend a lot upon tourism at our ocean side. So obviously, I want to talk to you a little bit about drilling off the coast. Democrats and Republicans, we kind of agree on this issue, that we're in opposition to drilling off the coast of Atlantic. So our state has been very concerned about this administration's proposal to open up the outer continental shelf to drilling. I certainly was pleased to hear that those plans are on hold, but it's very concerning that the administration is planning to proceed with the seismic air gun testing, a practice that causes extreme injury to marine animals, including dolphins and whales. considering the harm to wildlife, what is the justification for engaging in seismic testing when there is a little prospect of offshore drilling anytime soon?
Well, what we do is we receive these applications and we process them. I don't think we're at a stage where any have been approved, but we go through the process.
What applications are you talking about?
The
seismic?
seismic
Okay.
applications, yeah. And, you know, my view would be that there's seismic that occurs out there for other things already that don't need a permit from BOEM. But we'll go through, we'll do our analysis, we'll make our decision. And I think the way the regulation's written, if we say that there's a problem with the permit, then we need to explain how their application could be corrected. My own view is like, we shouldn't be afraid of information. If we can do it lawfully and it can be done responsibly, the data itself is not something that we should be afraid of.
I've had a hard time following you the entire time you've been speaking here in terms of enlightening us about the specific responses to any of the questions that have been answered. And this one isn't any better, because I don't understand why. One minute you're talking about science. Do you know whether or not this seismic testing negatively affects marine animals, including dolphins and whales? Do you know scientifically whether or not this is the case?
I haven't reviewed these applications at this
okay.
point in time, and
All right.
they haven't been placed before me. And
Okay, it just seems to me that that's something that we ought to look at
Well, I
from
think
the
there's
scientist's
litigation going
perspective.
on that.
I know that your department has spoken a lot with the industry groups about these plans, but as you consider these offshore drilling plans and this, whether or not we're going to boom, have you talked with the people from the coastal regions that are going to be impacted? Are you having those meetings with those kinds of people?
So, you know, for the program piece, we went out with a draft proposed program. And I know that Secretary Zinke went and spoke to several states. I personally went to Delaware, and I don't want to get the community wrong, but it's Bethany or
Who are you speaking to when you were out?
So when I was there, I went with the governor and met with some business owners and folks that had the potential to have their businesses in, they're primarily tourism-related businesses. I grew up in a community that was heavily dependent on tourism. And I can assure you, if we go forward with this plan, we will have lots of meetings in lots of communities.
Thank you. Mr. Bernhardt, I want to have a lot more confidence in what the Department of Interior is doing and how it's going to impact our wildlife, our potentially becoming extinct species, whether or not we're doing the right thing from a climate change perspective. Ms. Pingree asked you specific questions. You say that you're doing things regarding climate change, but you've not informed us of any one thing that you are doing that is addressing that issue. And for me, I'd like to know the specifics of what you think that your agency is doing to mitigate some of these problems that she's talking about. I particularly want the Atlantic Ocean to be a little bit warmer in Maine, because I can't get in it right now, but I understand what she is talking about. I also have a whole list of other questions regarding reports that have been done by your department by long-term employees with regard to the use of 2 pesticides in particular, and how I understand you were the one in particular who held that report back, and I want to know what is happening as a result of it, and will we be getting some other report that specifically deals with the impact of those 2 pesticides? And if I could find the name of them right now, I would try to call them out to you, but I know you know what they are.
Well, if you,
Someone was trying to whisper them to me. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, what we can do is we can work with you so that you have them listed. We can get a question for the record submitted, and we will ask the Secretary's office to respond back with that. I know what it's like to scramble for a word
Yeah.
when you have a lot of paper in front
Well,
of you.
it's just two little pesticide words that I'm sure Mr. Bernhardt,
I'm sure
as
there
an
are two
industry
pesticides with a-
representative, recognizes them, so
With
I'd
a big
appreciate a
impact,
response.
so-
I'm happy
Thank
to
you,
sit
I
down
yield
with
So
you
back.
we'll
and
get
talk
that
about
for the
those
record.
issues, too.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Congratulations, Mr. Bernhardt, on your promotion and your confirmation process, which I hope never to encounter. But we're glad to see you here. First, let me ask you, last summer I visited the gay mine on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation and heard concerns about the need for further cleanup. I don't have an ask of you today on this, but I would like to invite a dialogue with your department, the EPA, and other partners such as the tribes, the state of Idaho, and industry to see if we can find some common grounds on the cleanup in the area in the future of the Greater Pocatello and Fort Hall Indian Reservation, and I would invite you to those. I want to start by saying I applaud your work on realigning the sage-grouse management plans. The careful and thoughtful process has included conservation groups, states, ranchers, local community leaders. You oversaw this as Deputy Secretary, and now you have the chance to implement them as Secretary. Given that you essentially returned the proposal, which was the original Idaho plan, put forward, makes me very comfortable. Idaho's plan was a co-preferred alternative from the last administration before they went a little outside the scope of their authority. However, one of the key components of this process has been a legislative provision that keeps sage-grouse from being listed under the Endangered Species Act. This provision has been critical because an arbitrary listing decision was assigned to the Department of Interior by a judge who, quite frankly, isn't a wildlife biologist. I feel like this made the last administration rush to a decision which meant a condensed process for the creation of the management plans. I'm fearful that new legislation or new litigation will destroy all the hard work we have done through creating management plans and appropriating hundreds of millions for habitat improvements. That is why I've been supportive of continuing this legislative prohibition on listing. I understand your hands are tied in what you can request in the budget by OMB and the powers that be, but can you shed some light on this process and discuss some of the complications litigation will create on conserving sage-grouse?
Well, first, let me begin with the plans. On my first day as deputy, the secretary pulled me into his office and said, your first job is to deal with sage-grouse. And I'd spent my entire career avoiding sage-grouse, both at the department and the private sector. So what I did is I sat down with each governor or their staff and said, look, do you like your plan? And if they said yes, I said, great, you can keep your plan. And if you don't like your plan, can we talk about what the issues are? And I also told them to be mindful when they came up with their issues that what would they want their neighbor to do? Because collectively, these states manage these species, and it all needs to work. And I was very impressed by the governors, irrespective of party, in the modesty of their requests, recognizing the significant impact they might do to their neighbor with a bad decision. And I will tell you that Kate Brown, governor of Oregon, I called her at the end of the process. She was happy. The governor of Idaho was happy. The governor of Wyoming was happy. The governor of Colorado was happy. They're all happy. And what we did here is very significant. These land use plans still require us to try and manage for the conservation gain of the species or for no net loss of the species. The investment the public is making in sage-grouse is very, very significant. You see it from this committee in terms of the dollars that we're spending and have spent. Agriculture is spending a lot of money. The states have stepped up significantly. I think that what's happened here is very, very good. Environmental plaintiffs had sued the prior administration on their plan. When we finalized our plans, they went in and amended their complaint to then challenge our plans. And so My view here is that the language is helpful. What I don't want to see is this investment that's been made and is continuing to be made. I don't want that tarnished by a bad litigation outcome or an unnecessary listing. But, you know, if it's appropriate for us to list it, we will. I mean, we'll use the 5 factors and we'll make the decision. But when you look at what's happening here for the bird, honestly, it's very significant, and it's been a very concerted effort for nearly a decade. And that track record is real, and that's positive.
I appreciate that, and my point is, I'm not anti-sage grouse. It is, it's a species we've got to make sure it doesn't get on the listing, and our language to prevent listing in the past has been so that this progress can be made outside of the courts, frankly.
That's true.
Because it's going to be done by the Department of Interior, by the states, by the local communities, and not by a judge. So I appreciate that work that you've done on that.
Ms. Lawrence?
Thank you. Secretary, my district includes cities like Detroit, Hamtramck, Pontiac, and all these cities have a long legend rooted in the automotive industry, home of the Motor Cities National Heritage Area. The Motor Cities National Heritage Area preserves and promotes the all-American story of the auto industry. However, the National Heritage Areas at this time are still waiting for funds that were appropriated for fiscal year 19. 8 months into the current fiscal year, and the National Heritage Area still has not received their funding. Why has these funds not been allocated, and how do you have a plan and timeline? Because what's interesting is that S47, the recently passed Environmental Conservation Management, authorized 6 new heritage areas. And how is it that you're going to be in compliance with the law? You keep saying, Congress, you passed the law and we'll do it, when you haven't even addressed the existing ones.
Representative Lawrence, I'm going to have to look, I'm going to go back to the office and look specifically what you suggested, what you said about the F-19. I'm not disagreeing with you, but that's different than the information I have been told. And so I'm going to go back and find out today what's going on with those particular, that particular heritage area, and I'll get back to you. I respect the view about ones being added when our budget doesn't align with them. And, you know, I think when Danny Smith testified here, he talked about the fact that he prioritized based on operations. I actually think the heritage areas are a very useful and important device for communities. And, you know, we made some decisions in our budget. But in terms of getting them out quickly, I'll go back and double check because
I want to
gotten
be on the
criticized.
record because you repeatedly said the power rests with you at Congress, and we're voting and giving your department a directive, and you're not compliance with the existing one, and we have actually asked for additional ones. And so I really want to hear what's going to be said. I also want to say that you set the tone for the entire department when it comes to ethics and transparency. I serve on the Oversight Committee, and the Oversight Committee on Natural Resources are investigating whether your staff has been complying with transparency and record-keeping laws, including whether records related to your daily schedule was deleted or withheld from disclosure. On March 28th, the committee sent you a joint letter requesting transcribed interviews with 4 employees familiar. It has been over 5 weeks since the committee issued the letter, and the Interior has not scheduled the interviews or allowed the employees to contact. What are you doing, and when do you plan on scheduling these witnesses for interviews?
So I think we've sent the committee tens of thousands of pages of documents. They'll see every single calendar entry made from the day
we're
they
talking
started.
about the
We have every
witnesses'
single document.
interviews.
You have so much to review. We've offered a
But
briefing.
we as Congress
and
asked
when-
for them to come, and the last time I checked, you don't determine how we get our information. I appreciate what you sent, but the issue on the table is scheduling the witnesses for interviews, and you, sir, are the person who's responsible and set the tone. So I want to know, when do you plan on scheduling these witnesses?
I want to be very, very clear here. We have offered additional briefings, we've offered material, and at the right, we think it's not the appropriate time for interviews.
So your
But-
position is that you have the right to tell Congress when and what, how the information will be?
Of course not, but we do have a right to have a process that's fair and responsive. And,
So you
with
think
all
the
due-
process
in all-
isn't
in
fair
all
and
candor-
responsive?
In all candor, you sent these secretaries requests, and they obviously have to make their choice. But you're talking about individual employees that have been long-standing employees within the department. And when you want to shoot at me, that's comes with the territory. But these are people, we have wonderful career employees here that are very, they've never had this happen to them in their career. And I just think people ought to think about that for a minute.
I would like to tell you, Mr. Secretary, when you entered into this position, into serving as the secretary, I hope during the interrogation of your being suitable that you understand the checks and balances. Somewhere along the line, this perception that when a committee on Congress asks for a hearing, that we are now engaging in war. We have, throughout the history of Congress, conducted government oversight. And the request for the information, if there's nothing to hide, the transparency piece serves more than Congress, it serves the people. And my time is up, so this will be my last comment here. You have been requested to comply. And with all due respect of all the power and the experience that you have, you are required to comply. And I am really frustrated right now being in Congress. Every time we address this administration, you are creating a new criteria for responding to checks and balances and transparency. And I expect, without having to go to court and demand it, that you, as the secretary, comply. Thank you.
I completely respect your role under the Constitution.
Thank you, and for the record, we have things that we've requested, and this was a request made by another committee that the member serves on, who also does oversight over your jurisdiction with Mr. Cummings. Mr. Quigley.
I want to follow up on what Ms. Lawrence said, Ms. Secretary, and that's, look, she talked about a proud, rich heritage that her district has on certain areas. I don't shy away from it. I'm from Chicago, which has a less
Proud,
than
rich
extraordinary reputation on certain things. But I got to tell you, it's pretty impressive. 4 days into your tenure, the Inspector General opened an ethics investigation into a, quote, wide assortment of questionable conduct on your part. So spare us that we're coming after your career employees. As you say, this is about you. And the questions raised, leaving meetings with questionable private interest off your public calendar and changing your public calendar, which may violate federal record laws, rolling back endangered species protections to benefit your former clients, engaging in illegal lobbying activities, and blocking scientific study on the impact of certain pesticides on several endangered species to benefit the makers of these pesticides. I got to tell you, I'd respect you a lot more if you said, my predecessor didn't get carried off on people's shoulders for being the most open and ethical person in government, and I'm going to do pretty much what I can to follow the interest of those not in the Department of Interior or what Interior is all about, but the corporate interest I'm really put here to do. I'd respect you a lot more if you just came out and said that, than said, we're coming after your employees. So if you could, without saying that we're blaming your employees, what is your response to the fact that 4 days in, the Inspector General opens this investigation?
So my response is that I take ethics extremely seriously. I believe that public trust is a public responsibility. I believe in maintaining an ethical culture, and I believe that I have fully complied with my ethics pledge, my ethics agreements, all laws regarding ethics and all regulations. I actively consult with the ethics officials, and I am very confident in our not only my ethics practices, but my record-keeping practices. So that is what I'd say, and I take offense to the concept about profiting and your allegation that I'm here to do the bidding of
Prove me wrong, sir.
Well, let me prove you wrong. The presumption is that I came here just like you to do the work of the public. At the end of the day, you were elected to a position. I've gone through a process. I've been confirmed for that position.
I had to file
And-
petitions and get votes, sir.
And the reality is, the Constitution has a variety of mechanisms. And certainly, the review will take place, but I know that I've followed the law. I've followed the guidance I've received from the experts, and I've sought their guidance.
So you say every one of the allegations that they brought up and the ones I listed are categorically wrong, and none of those are accurate?
I am confident that when things are reviewed, I will have complied. Confident.
Let's talk about the government shutdown. You kept part of your agency open, the part that reviewed new drilling on public land issues. Over the course of the shutdown, these workers approved 15 new leases for drilling on public land and 71 new permits for offshore drilling. But during the shutdown, you did not act on maintaining services that dealt with stewardship, conservation, or even the very basic
That's outrageous.
responsibility of looking after our nation's national parks.
That's outrageous. Let me give you some facts. When I was,
It is outrageous.
let me give you some facts. You asked the question. So number one, I think the shutdown began on the 21st of December. On the 25th, I was out on the National Mall picking up trash, filling up a truck from the National Park Service because there was no one else to do it.
Why wasn't that essential?
That the issue here, and this is a great question. So what I realized is that was over, that our contingency plan was not sustainable. It was not going to be good for the parks. It wasn't going to be good for the people. And so I made some decisions that people can criticize. But the reality is what I did, the action I took, put people back to work, and we have money. You get a quarterly report talking about our carryover. We have money, and I put that money to work.
If you
And I
thought
did
it was important enough
lawfully.
for
I
you to
did
go
it
out and
lawfully.
pick up litter, why didn't you think it was important enough to keep your workers out there, keeping our national parks
Well, that's not-
clean
that's not
and
the
not
way-
permanently damaged has
That's not
been?
what the contingency plan was made. As soon as I realized that, we began a process to evaluate different alternatives, whether it was under that Anti-Deficiency Act or other alternatives we might have. I came up with an alternative, and we changed the contingency plan. We
My time
addressed
is
it.
up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe before my distinguished colleague got here, you talked about you have taken the steps to hire 45 ethics.
42.
42 ethics people to help with the agency, so you will avoid any conflicts or help your employees avoid any conflicts or issues going forward. And I thought of enough to write it down because that seems to be an awful lot of hires. But anyhow, expanding on the point of my distinguished chairman, you had opened the parks, or you went through the contingency plan, and you felt it important to open up the parks. Where was the stream of funding that you used for that?
So basically, after people miss their first paycheck, if they make $18 an hour, you know what they are doing? They're hurting. We had people that were calling our ethics office asking if it was okay to sell their plasma. And you know what I decided? I decided I was going to look at every tool we had, irrespective of the popularity, and see what tools existed. It turned out that here's the way the Park Service contingency plan worked. They would basically shut things down, like to say the Statute of Liberty. And then they would turn to the state and say, hey, if you want to keep the Statute of Liberty open, it'll be $780,000. They did this in Arizona at the Grand Canyon. They were asking for money to keep certain locations open, certain locations closed. And at the same time, they were sitting on over $200 million of fee-generated revenue. And when I looked at the legal authority of utilizing the fees, what had been done in the past, at which I've provided this committee, by the way, all of the past standards, when I did that, I realized that we could protect the parks by making sure that they had law enforcement, that they were cleaned up, and that they were safe. We could allow people to go. I was married in a national park, and or right outside in Estes Park, right outside Rocky Mountain National Park. And the concept of not being able to use the park for my wife's and my wedding, I'm not sure I would have survived that event. I don't think when the Congress and the House, or the Congress and the President can't agree on the budget, we necessarily need to close the parks if we have $300 million sitting around. But you know who was really happy about that? Is the people on the mall that got to go back to work and have that money knowing that they were going to have a paycheck in a week and a half or so. If you would have gone one more day with the shutdown, the people that I had working would have gotten some pay, others wouldn't, and they would have been happy about it. They need it. They're the least, many of them are the least compensated people we have in our work. And it's fundamentally wrong to have money and not put them to work if we can lawfully. The suggestion Mr. Quigley has is make them essential and not guarantee them pay. That's a hell of a statement. Thank you.
And the money that was spent, or the money that was expended during that period of time, was that returned to the coffers for the use in rehabilitating or
Well,
repair that's necessary to
The
be
way
done
you
after
wrote
the shutdown?
the way you wrote the CR, we were able to basically re-examine that and ensure that the operation account money was spent. And so actually, technically, not a penny of the fee money will have actually been spent, which is pretty significant, and we really appreciate that.
And I've heard this brought up on a number of occasions, and I find it a little disturbing that the parks, people, American citizens, or maybe not, came into the park during the time the parks were shut down and did damage to things like the sequoia trees and other things. Do you know from any investigation, that wasn't interior employees, those were just random individuals who came into the park
So
during
I
that
think,
time?
so one of the flaws of the initial contingency plan, in my opinion, was, and I think the contingency plan was sort of a reaction to the 2013 shutdown that I'm not very familiar with, but they even they tried to shut the World War II Memorial, which if you've been there is really not a facility that embodies that. But as a reaction to that, it was let's leave things open. I think what I did with the plan is keep people there to have law enforcement, amenities like restrooms, other things, keep those things going, allow for fair management of the people so you don't have fights about campsites, other things like that, manage it, and do that while not providing all of the services, the video in the visitor center, maybe not even the video center. I called it basic services that fell within the program. And I think if we do that for future events like this, we can have both the enjoyment of the parks and the protection of the parks. And that's really what my policy goal was.
Well, preferably, we'll do our jobs and we'll never have a
Oh, well, that
shutdown
would be
again.
true, too.
I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Before I ask my second round of questions, I want to get a couple of housekeeping things straight. GAO is looking into the way the fees are being used, so the referee has not made the call as to whether or not that was a
appreciate
correct decision, and we'll find that out shortly. The oil and gas employees were brought back, but part of the problem that and I don't have the statute in front of me, but having read more about deficiencies and shutdowns than I ever want to have to again in my life, part of the challenge was that you also should have brought back the wind and solar employees back, and only the oil and gas, and so as you go forward with contingency plans, but just that was not necessarily a perfect call.
That's, I think that I would find that entirely acceptable. If that oversight exists, we can change the contingency plan on that.
But the law wasn't followed to the full spirit of the law when only part of the employees were brought back and not all of them were. Then to your comment, sir, about your quarterly reports, Mr. Joyce and I are trying to get the Interior Appropriations Bill ready to go on the 15th. Mr. Joyce and I will be meeting shortly to go over some numbers. Throughout this process, the committee, both sides of the aisle, have had difficulty receiving routine background information from the department and from some of the bureaus, and that's basic budget information that has been shared between the committee and the department staff for many, many years. We still have not received second quarter January, February, and March numbers, and we're being told by the Congressional Budget Office that they're having problems getting all the information that they need to do to score our draft bill, which is a problem. So I know that it's your intention that we get these reports, that you have those reports, but as you're the secretary, recently confirmed, you need to know that we're going to not ask for your help, we're going to ask you to get us the numbers so that we can move forward. I don't know if it's staff, if it's political appointees, I don't know who it is in the congressional office is not getting things done, but I know you want to have our bill scored too.
You know, when we had our meeting, we talked about some specific items, and I think we got most of those up to you. I actually brought with me the spend plan you requested. So we want to make sure you have what you need. I'll have to look into these other items. I don't think we talked about them specifically.
The point is these are routine numbers that have routinely been shared, and they're not anymore, and I know we will get to
I'll
the
get to the
bottom of
bottom
that
of it.
together.
That's fine.
Now to my question, I want to go back to reorganization, and it's twofold. One has to do with reorganization in general, and then what we're hearing from our colleagues, our tribal nation leaders. Your budget requests $22 million for the organization, $25 million of it, which is in the jurisdiction of the Interior Subcommittee. Last week, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Scott Cameron testified that the DOI reorganization proposal before the House Natural Resources Committee, and I quote him as saying, "We are proceeding deliberately and intentionally on all aspects of the reorganization." You and I touched on this briefly when we met in the office, but for the record, does the DOI have a comprehensive plan for the proposed reorganization? And some of this I know you're probably going to get back to me on, so I'll read the others.
So
Because the committee to date has not received anything.
I think I committed to you months ago that if this moved forward, you'd get a detailed plan, and I think you can say that you don't have a detailed plan. We have a spend plan that we brought today, I'll give you, but I know full well that we need to have a plan that will pass muster for you. I do believe that the core elements that we talked through matter, and we'll provide it to you, I can assure you.
So because there is nothing that's been agreed upon. I want to clear for the record that we are going to have, and that's the four corners, that includes our colleagues in the Senate, working with Mr. Joyce, that we will go forward on working with you. So it's your intention to follow the subcommittee's reprogramming requirements before carrying out any employee allocations?
It is my intent to follow exactly what we agreed to, and I don't know the technical difference with the allocation, but my view is that I'm committed to following the reprogramming guidelines to the T.
Okay, well, we'll work on that. Intentions are good, but actions speak even
Oh, I know
louder.
that, but we haven't made any reprogramming requests to you on the reorganization. We
But the-
haven't.
I know, but there was still in the president's budget money for reprogramming, and as the budget comes forward, we'll work on that, so.
That's fair.
That was put in, but we were going through your confirmation hearing, so fair is fair. So let me tie that back to what is going on with tribal consultation. Mr. Cameron's statement, also in the Committee on Oversight and Investigations, and I quote from him, "After much input from the department's career senior executive staff, Congress, governors, and external stakeholders, including consultation with Indian tribal leaders, a map was finalized and the unified regions took effect on August 22nd, 2018. According to your website, the unified regional boundary map was published on July 20th, 2018. However, the first tribal consultation occurred on June 30th, and the final consultation occurred on August 23rd. So it's clear from the timeline that the tribal consultation was, it appears to be an afterthought to the reorganization. And I say this because last week, Chairman Fraser of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe described the so-called consultation, and these are his words, and I quote from the Chairman Fraser. "When they came to the region, the Great Plains region, we were given a picture of a map. That's all we were given. We weren't given any plans of the purpose or how the change was needed or how it was going to benefit our people. It was never done, and that's all we were given." So we've heard in committee, all of us here, statements from the administration officials that testified in front of Mr. Bureau of Indian Affairs is not part of the proposed larger reorganization. But now we're hearing from Indian tribes that there are various actions being taken that look and feel like an informal reorganization, such as headquarter employees being moved out west. There are 3 tribes in Arizona that have been notified by the Salt River BIA agency officer that they will be consolidated into another BIA Western Region agency, into the BIA Western Region office. So there is movement taking place that our tribal colleagues are telling us about it. So we need to know, is the BIA being reorganized? Is either part of the larger department reorganization, or is there something going on separately? And what the tribal consultation was that occurred. Is there a BIA reorganization that is still being considered as part of the larger reorganization? Is the department proposing to consolidate the Salt River BIA agency office into either the BIA Western Region agency or to the BIA Western Region office? There is great confusion on this committee right now about what is going on with meaningful and direct tribal consultation. So we need to get to the bottom of this, and we need to get it quickly. I know that the movement to a separate Bureau of Indian Education was well received by this committee, and we look forward to working and making that be a successful program. But when we start hearing from the tribes that people are being moved around, they aren't being consulted, it goes in direct conflict to everything that we have heard from people from the agencies in front of us. And we need to clear this up quickly, and you know, the time is of the essence.
So we'll get to the bottom of it, but let me be very, very clear. We are not reorganizing as part of the unified regions in any way, the BIA or BIE. They want it out of it. We have, and I think separating BIE from BIA is a major significant thing, and it's a good thing.
For the record, that's the Bureau of,
Oh, I'm sorry, Bureau of Indian Education from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Beyond that, I'll have to get back to you on it because there's no reorganization.
so let's stop the clock on that for whatever's going on that you may or may not be aware of that started before you were given the position that you have as secretary. So for the record, that stopped, nothing's moving forward, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and we will be in contact with the tribal
I want Tara to
leaders.
have the ability to like improve her organization, but that's different than moving people and reorganizing. I'll have to figure it out.
Well, improving to one person in an agency might look like improvement to another
That's
person.
fair.
It might look
I'll
like
coordinate
total
with you.
reorganization without tribal consultation. I know that's not your intent, and I want you to know that that's what's
appreciate-
bubbling under the
I
surface.
appreciate the input.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. If nobody else will say it, let me say it. Mr. Secretary, thank you for what you did during the shutdown to lessen the pain on employees and the public during the Trump-Schumer-Pelosi shutdown. As the ranking member said, we hope we never do that again. We've done it numerous times in the last few years, and it never is good policy or good politics. So in 2018, we were able to pass language in the omnibus and the Farm Bill addressing forest management. Specifically, there was language that would allow land managers to address fallen trees on power lines and right-of-ways in an expeditious manner. I don't have to tell you or the public why this is important to wildfire prevention. Can you shed some light on the implementation of this provision, which you know as vegetation management?
So we're trying to move very aggressively. We have that provision. We have the president's direction. We have Secretary Zinke put out a direction. Look, I think most of the land we have, although we have some forest land in the Northwest, most of our fire measures tend to be more on range fires and brush and grasses. We have to be effective at more effective at managing, and that will include significant efforts to maintain and bring areas into a realm of reason, or these fires are going to be out of control. If you look at grazing, that's one opportunity, but we're looking at our travel management plans, our vegetation management plans. We're doing everything we can, and obviously we've proposed some legislation as part of our budget regarding NEPA, but we have to be more aggressive in this area. And I think people are realizing that. When the national governors were out here, I met with a number of them, and up and down the coast, on the West Coast, they realize, and they're actually being, in some ways, more aggressive than we are, and we need to get with the program.
Deferred maintenance. I noticed in your budget that you expand the legislative ask for the Public Lands Infrastructure Fund to include BLM. I think this is a great addition and something I authored in 2 bills last year, the Lands Act and the Restore Our Parks Act. Both have received great bipartisan support. We worked very hard with Secretary Zinke trying to look at the backlog maintenance in our parks. In fact, he flew out and rode around Yellowstone and Teton Park with us when the chairwoman and others were out there trying to get us to see if there was some way we could get his legislation that he was proposing in the omnibus. We hope to work with you to craft some legislation that will work to address the backlog maintenance in our national parks, because it's absolutely certain as you travel around these parks, and I mean, we love our national parks to death, and we saw some things that are going to become and are great problems if we don't address them and do so relatively rapidly.
So I'm all in, and I'll tell you something on that. I think in my confirmation process, I met with 40-plus senators of both, you know, a mix of both parties, and almost every one of them brought up the maintenance backlog in some way. I think there's an opportunity there, and I know that there's the technicalities of everything, but I think there's really room, that there's really a broad basis and a recognition that we need to do something with the infrastructure of the lands that we manage. And I'd like to help with that. I think it's important, and I think we're doing ourselves no favors by not addressing it.
And I think the public supports it greatly also.
That's true.
Last question. I understand you're constrained by your budget request by sequestration. That is not something you choose. That was Congress, and we have to address that before we can get on with doing our appropriation bills. We have to come up with a long-term plan. But the consequences of this is a popular program like LWCF is not funded. Obviously, you and the president support the program because he signed a funding bill last year that gave an increase to the program. I also saw you at the White House when the president signed permanent reauthorization, higher than any year in recent memory. However, I'd like to make a plug for a program as a supporter. I'd also like to make a plug for the Upper Snake River South Fork Special Recreation Management Area, the BLM project, which isn't on this year's list. Perhaps we can look into it as a rec access funds on how we make this possible in the near future. And if you've never been down to South Fork, I'd invite you. I'd be happy to take you down to South Fork. It's a trip to remember.
Yes, sir.
I tried to take the committee, when you were out there.
I know you did. I know you tried to have us all go out there. There's lots of places to see all across the continental United States, Alaska, Hawaii, and our wonderful, wonderful territories. Ms. Pingree.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your persistence in answering our questions. I'm sure if you could go to the South Fork right now with my colleague, you'd go, so I'm sure we all would too, so. What's that?
It might be pretty cold this time.
Yeah, that's true. We get our down coats. I want to follow up on the offshore drilling question. My colleague's from New Jersey, and as you know, I'm from Maine, so you can imagine in Maine, it's unanimous opposition to this. Every member of the delegation of all parties, our governor, most people in our state are very concerned about these ideas. Because we have the constraints of it being a very much of a tourism state. We have a lot of people who work in the marine industry, lobster fishing, all the things I've already talked to you about. And so I'm interested in pinning you down a little bit about this, because I think it is a big concern. A third of the population of the United States lives in coastal areas that would be impacted by this proposal. And I know Representative Kilmer, who's not here today because of a family issue, from Washington State, would have been talking to you about this as well. So when the Wall Street Journal interviewed you 2 weeks ago, you reported that the proposal had been, I'm putting this in quotes, sidelined indefinitely. You noted that the recent court ruling to protect areas of the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans from drilling was the reason for the decision to delay, and further stated it's going to take a while. So I guess I want to know a little more, what does sidelined indefinitely mean for the 2019-2024 plan for offshore oil and gas leasing? Will the areas in that 2019 draft proposed program be taken entirely off the table and protected permanently from risky drilling? If so, which areas, and when does the administration plan to issue the 2019-2024 proposed program?
So,
And if you want to say right now, it's all off the table, I'll just
I
make a little note and we're good.
I really appreciate that. I will tell you this, before I answer your question specifically. I recognize Maine has a phenomenally beautiful coast, and it's an important the OCS is an important economic driver to you. I had a good chance to have a discussion with Senator King about this. I got to respond to Senator Collins about it. I appreciate it, and I will say that for the history of the program, really probably since the history of the Submerged Lands Act, I'm not aware of a single lease that was ever developed over the opposition of a state. And when you look at what we are required to do under the law in making a decision, the views of a state are very important. So I want to tell you that right at the outset, and I mean it, okay? I mean it. Now, Now, our process is one where we request information, then we develop a proposed, we take public comment, we then develop a proposed program, we then develop a proposed program with a draft proposed program, then we develop the proposed program, and then we develop a proposed final. Right now, where we are is the draft proposed program was developed and put out for comment, and the thought would be, okay, what are we going to do next on the proposed program, just so you know where we are. I don't think that article quotes me saying sidelined indefinitely. That may be a quote from the article, but I don't think those are the words that I would have used.
So you're not saying it is currently sidelined?
What I was trying to express is like, look, one of the important, in developing a program, one of the important components to start with is where things are available. And under the act, Secretary Zinke said basically we're going to look at everything as we winnow it down. At the very beginning of this administration, the president made a decision on a decision that related to a decision that President Obama had made, and a district court has found that that decision was unlawful, and that decision is then likely to be appealed. I don't want to say it's definitely going to be appealed, because ultimately, Department of Justice makes that call. But my concern right now is, okay, I have options. One option is I just proceed forward as if the case didn't exist. Another option would be to take the case, and even if we think it's wrongly decided, take it as gospel and develop a plan. Both of those things seem odd to me, particularly when I don't know for sure the outcome. And so my view is I'm grappling with what is the best pathway, what makes the most sense, and I haven't made a decision on that yet. And from my perspective, we have a plan in place through 2022. So I have a little time to get it straight. And what I'm trying to do is make the most informed decision based on the factual situation that I find myself in. I will tell you this, that there's no way a plan's going forward without a lot of comment. I'm not going to surprise you if we go forward with a plan, and I'll promise you that a plan is not imminent at this time. I have to work through these issues, and they're not, the outcome is not certain.
Well, I think you know that we certainly hope the outcome is certain in the negative, and my time is run out, so I can't ask you any further questions, but when you tell me how many science vacancies that there are, I'd love to know how many science vacancies there are at BOEM, because I do think it's important to have good scientists there doing the evaluation, and
That should be easy to give you.
thanks. I yield back, even though I didn't have any time to yield back.
We have 15 minutes left in the hearing, which means we have 3 more questions, and then Mr. Joyce and I will conclude the hearing it might be like 3 or 5 minutes after 5. So appreciate your indulgence on this. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Amade.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize for my lateness, but apparently when Mr. Stewart returned to Utah last week on that Delta airplane, he broke a few things during his 3.5-hour flight, so they were less than cooperative. I have also been advised by the former chairman of this committee that those people who show up as late as I do shouldn't ask questions when they do get here late. So, thank you, Mr. Bernhardt, for your open-door policy. I look forward to working with Mr. Valadeo's former Chief Moore. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Wow.
Well, you notice that was the former chair. I always welcome your questions, so. Ms. Lawrence.
Yes, Secretary, I have listened with great interest about what happened during the shutdown, and appreciate your comments on actions that you took. I want you to comment on 2 things. Our chair had some disagreements with some of the procedures and priorities that you set. Has the National Park Service conducted a complete assessment of the damage done to the parks during the shutdown? And if not, how do we get to the point where we're not, if this ever happens again, based on the president's comments that he would shut it down, and he did? How do we get to the point that you have a clear expectation of what the priorities are? And have you done an assessment, and do we have the funding to repair the damages that were made?
Well, first on any damage, I haven't seen a report. I've been told that a report is being developed, but I haven't seen it personally. I think we'll find.
Is your department doing the report?
Well, it'd be the National Park Service, ma'am. But what we will find, I think, is that things happen at parks that are closed, things happen at parks that are open. And that's not to minimize them, but in terms of like permanent damage, I sent, one of the first things I did when I said, go back and clean them up, fix them up, was take care of them. And so I think that most things have been remediated if they were remediatable, and I feel confident about that. In terms of not having a list of priorities again, I would say this, or a disagreement with priorities. And we'll see what GAO says, and I'll respect, they'll have a view, I'll have a view, and we'll deal with that appropriately. But here's the thing. I do believe that our national parks are somewhat different in that we have people from all over the world that are coming to them. We have families that are taking their vacations based on them. And I think if we have a tool to keep them open, whether it's a statutory tool or a different tool, we should do that. It has tremendously negative impacts, the closure, on the gateway communities around the parks. It devastates them. It has tremendously negative effects to our employees. And if we have the money and can spend it appropriately and lawfully, I'm for that, to be candid with you. And if you have a different method, or we think that this contingency plan should be different, here's what I believe. I believe that our contingency plans were based on a theory of a very short shutdown. And that might have been okay, but that was wrong in a long shutdown. And we adjusted our plans accordingly, and I feel that that was a good decision. I had to make that decision in the middle of the moment. And look, I think I'm the first person in history that's taken over the Department of the Interior during a shutdown. And so, and if you look at some of my memos, they have typos because I'm the guy typing it. And so, but I also feel good about the decision. When I was out in the mall, I realized that like it was not a sustainable position. We had to look at the choices in the law and make the best one I could, and I'll defend it. And I appreciate that other people can have different views. I do.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, and I agree that we should review our policy and make statutory policy as far as what should happen. Because while you were put in this situation, I respect the challenge of it. We had an expectation, and if you have an expectation, it should be policy that you must follow. So I appreciate that, but I would ask this committee to please follow up, and so that we have a clear understanding of what damage was done. I don't want to hear later on that, well, we're not doing certain things because it was damaged, and you're saying that there's no funds to fix it or to repair it. So if the National Parks is doing an assessment, you said you think they are, right?
I think they are.
So I would just like to see that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentlewoman for her question, and shutdowns do have consequences. We have requested that. I'm sure the Park Service will be forthcoming. But there were people who, in Indian Health Care Services, who couldn't access diabetes medicine. There were research projects, I know, at the University of Minnesota that were totally destroyed because of shutdown policies. So a lot more than our parks were affected by that. That's why we need to work hard to get our bills passed on the floor, get the Senate moving, and get them signed into law. With that, I turn to Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Sir, and I appreciate the fact that an important moment of your life happened at Estes outside Rocky Mountain. That's correct, right? Yeah. I was there in 2017 with the National Park Conservation Association, studying the effects of climate change on the national parks. And I think it's worthwhile for you to appreciate the fact that while we were observing whole swaths of sides of mountains with gray skeletons that were trees suffering the ravages of climate change, and in the day we were at the headwaters of the Colorado River talking about how a degree change in temperature dramatically alters just how much precipitation is snow or rain. And as a result of climate change, a lot more rain, a lot less retention, and impacts on the park, but also all those who benefit from the Colorado. You know, and at that moment, we were shooting this out on social media. Your boss, the president, decided to pull out of the Paris Accord. So it's important for us to understand how the actions here by this administration have dramatically altered the future of our national parks. But I want to follow up on Ms. Pingree remarks and talking about drilling on our coast. In May of 2017, your predecessor directed the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, pronounced Bessie, to review the well control rule. This was a key offshore drilling safety measure issued during the Obama administration. It was to address the shortcomings of offshore drilling safety that led to, it was done following BP's Deepwater Horizon disaster. Last year, they issued a proposal encouraging energy exploration and production of outer continental shelf and reducing unnecessary regulatory burdens. This might be one of those regulatory ones that are necessary. It reduces tests to key equipment such as blowout preventers, which are the last ditch defense against massive gushers. It allows drillers to use third-party companies instead of government inspectors to check equipment. So you can appreciate why people are even more concerned with the fact that this was never going to happen and that burdensome regulation. And the fact that it wasn't there led to the BP disaster. And we've seemingly opened the door to this, and now talking about opening the door to further exploration and drilling where it can do the most damage. Doesn't this rule change concern you and give you pause about moving forward?
So I would, first off, suggest that we have an opportunity to brief you on the well control rule. I think that you would find the briefing useful. I think you would find that there were a number of things that we believe are actually improve safety. There's other things that folks wanted that we didn't do. And let me give you a perspective of my own. I grew up in a town in western Colorado that was highly dependent on the utilization of natural resources and on tourism. And I believe you can do both. But when I was a kid, my best friend's dad died in a mine accident. And we played football together all the way up. And I have never forgot the fact that when I always left the locker room, my dad was there, his wasn't. I take safety very, very seriously. And I think that this rule strikes a balance. I appreciate you having a different view. But I'd welcome the opportunity to have folks in to brief you, let you make your own decision.
Just in the limited time, tell us how the things I talked about, like reducing tests to key equipment such as blowout preventers, is a compromise.
The fact of the matter is, the more you test equipment, also leads to the greater likelihood that it will fail when
Well, if
necessary.
you take that to its illogical conclusion, we'd never test anything.
There's a balance, and the question is the balance. We also created some alternative mechanisms for things to be reviewed earlier. I feel good about the rule. I appreciate that you don't. I'd say I'd love to talk to you about it more.
Again, our time is limited, and And I appreciate that you haven't lost the fervor and enthusiasm you had in protecting your previous clients in your previous life.
I'm for making the people of America better off and safer.
Starting with your former clients.
Mr. Joyce, do you have any questions that you're going to be submitting for the record?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Joyce, would you please turn on your microphone?
As a matter of fact, I will. You know, it's too bad we don't have enough time to continue to address some of these things that are actually about the budget and the running of the department, but in not getting there, I have questions regarding the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Public Safety and Justice. You know, as a former prosecutor, I have some certain issues there that I think need to be rectified, about the law enforcement officers that are necessary. I have a number of questions that I couldn't get to, so bear with me for a second here. Tribal courts, transparency for the Government Accountability Office recommended with the Indian Affairs, and international conservation, which is something that we're actually doing very well with, and appreciate the efforts of the department on those type of things. And that would be it. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to have, there are other members who might have questions for the records, but, and they have till the end of the week to submit those, but the ones that you can look forward coming from me deal with the Freedom of Information Act, that requests be held and honored and filled in a timely manner. Oil and gas activity in national monuments dealing with pre-leasing, and also climate change and ESA regulations revisited, specifically about what do we do about critical habitat designation when climate change is the primary threat to the species. So I want to thank the committee members for being here. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. We look forward to having our questions answered, and as you and I have discussed, getting some of the information in a timely fashion, as our subcommittee will be marking up on May, this month. I thought I had the date, and I was told this month, so stay tuned. Thank you. With this meeting is adjourned.